how that allows, it's sort of the template for dealing with stress later on, being able to really deal with any social problem-solving situation. So, very briefly, first, people need to be able to regulate, babies, kids, whatever. We'd always talk about regulation and sensory integration, OT, and all those kinds of things that help us learn about someone's capacity to self-regulate and help them do that. You have to be regulated, and then the sort of really important piece, you have to be connected with somebody else, engaged, if you will. Getting back to what Cynthia was saying about, you know, the child with his hands folded, what I think about is not whether people can do their work independently in class, because what those kids are really doing is they're doing their work, but they're doing it within the context of a class relationship. People, mirror neurons work. If you've heard of mirror neurons, it makes you sort of mirror what other people are doing. If you watch a typical class, you'll see this, you know this. You see somebody move, somebody else moves. They're all kind of moving in a mass. It's a bit of a Borg if you're a Star Trek fan. I mean, everybody's kind of connected in a certain way, and they're not really as independent as we would like to think. So anyway, they're engaged with each other, engaged in this milieu. So you need to be regulated, engaged, and then there has to be some sort of flow of interaction. And so to boil the entire DIR process down into just a couple things that we're looking for people to be regulated, calm enough to be interacting in the moment. So, you know, if you're running around in the field, you don't want to be too calm, but if you're in class, you don't want to be too active. We need to do things to help people be reasonably regulated. And when we talk about being reasonably regulated, we really talk about what we're doing to help the child be regulated. We're not talking about the goal that the child will be calm. We're talking really, when we're coaching staff or ourselves or parents, we're talking about what can we do so that the child's able to regulate within that context. And that is what helps the child be more able to self-regulate over time. So regulated, and then engaged, trying to feel the love of the moment, something really good and rich. And then make that interaction happen. So we talk about circles of interaction where the child's doing something. Always starts with what the child's doing. Always starts with that initiation. And some of you might say, well, my child doesn't really initiate. He's just kind of sitting there. But you know what? He's breathing. He's doing something. He may be pawing at the carpet. If you read this old Greenspan stuff, there's always this sort of iconic scene where, you know, the child's pawing at the carpet, right? You've seen people do things like this, right? And they're just perseverating, stimming, whatever the heck they're doing, right? And then Greenspan puts his hand in the way, and what does the child do? Does anybody know this story? He takes the hand and puts it there. And so the child's doing something, the adult does something, or the other person, and then the child responds. That's considered one circle of interaction. I know it's sort of a funny definition. But the point is that you've interposed yourself, playfully, hopefully, not aggressively necessarily, into the child's world, and they've had to respond to you somehow, so that they're changing their world bit by bit over time. And you chain those things over time. And yeah, you blow it half the time, kids go berserk, they're too withdrawn, but you try and you keep trying again and you persist, and eventually you're able to get a flow of interaction that gets ever more complex. I'll give you one more kind of contrast so that you understand a little bit more about what I'm saying. Because when we talk about this being regulated, engaged, and then in this flow of interaction, of course, that moves towards more complex, symbolic, and logical thinking. And people say, logic? Oh, logical. Oh, my kid's logical. He can talk about, you know, problem solving and putting Legos together and stuff, you know, till the end of the world. But what we're really talking about is social problem solving, not being able to put things together, but being able to put things together, being able to figure out the social problem of the moment. And there's always a social problem of the moment, always. Even if you're in a study carrel in college studying for your exam, there is a social problem of that moment. It's, am I going to pass? What will my parents think? Do people care about me while I'm here alone studying at night? I mean, there are all those things. And if you're not really aware of those, if you're merely robotically going through the motions, it doesn't really help you later on. We actually share kids who are this big, and we've got, what, 28-year-old kid as well, who we also share right now. So from all the way through, from people who aren't talking to people who have finished college and we're trying to get them on a career. These things are happening all the time. In every interaction, you got to be reasonably regulated, with or without caffeine, reasonably engaged with somebody, and in some fashion, even if it's the people aren't right there, and then have some kind of interaction going to be able to build on each other's ideas and to be able to solve those problems. So that's DIR in a nutshell. I want to add one other idea and draw just one thing,
Sure.
and that's really thinking about DIR in association with ABA, applied behavioral analysis, because they're really very complementary when you think about it right. So there are a lot of people who might say, well, ABA, I mean, you really got to look at, the behavior and the consequences and the antecedents, and, it's all very external in some people's minds, and top down in terms of this is what the child's going to learn, that sort of thing. And we could talk a little bit more about it later, because there's some gorgeous ABA today, I can tell you about it. But the way, I don't take credit for any of these ideas. You heard about Greece and Rome. Greece, they came up with the ideas. Rome, they spread them. I'm more Roman than Greek. But Greenspan, before he died, his last book talked about something called the learning tree, where he sort of put this DIR model together in a tree form. So if you think about the roots being the things that help you stay steady, stable, kind of the individual differences part, everybody's a little bit different. So you might talk about sensory modulation and processing, motor tone and planning, receptive communication, which means a lot of nonverbal stuff, not just the verbal, expressive communication, so kind of output to the world, right, being able to communicate. I made too many of these. Visual, spatial processing, so much of our brains is, we're predators, we're set up to do that, right? And then some people call it executive function, praxis, whatever, but it's being able to come up with an idea, and then this is actually important, come up with an idea, and then have some sort of plan of what you're going to do for it, and then a sequence of steps of what you're going to do, and then execute the darn thing. And then what always happens when you execute a plan? Never comes out the way you planned. I hit the road today. I made great time in traffic, by the way. But could I find the building? I couldn't see the numbers? Of course not. I had to change my plan, do a different search pattern to try to figure out where I was going to be. So you always have to adapt. And our kids get stuck at any of these levels. Sometimes they just don't have the idea. And then they might have the idea but feel so frustrated because they can't figure out the plan. Or they have the plan, but what's the sequence? What order do you do it? What do you have to do to communicate? Well, they might even have all that, but then they just don't execute. How many of you have kids you've worked with or your own kids who they know what they ought to do, they just don't do it? And then how many of these people will execute a plan, will do something, but when it doesn't go right, it's a problem. They can't adapt. So anyway, that's this part. Those are the roots. The trunk is what I was talking about with the, we call them functional, emotional, developmental levels. But basically, the big three are being able to help someone to regulate, engage, find the love, and then have reciprocal social interaction for problem solving. Okay, so that's the trunk. But what happens? So who cares if you can do that if you can't do stuff? Well, where does great learning, training, behavioral work come in? You can't be a firefighter, you can't be a soldier, you can't be an astronaut if you don't learn all the stuff. And that's, to me, or to Greenspan anyway, where all the wonderful training can come in. And to me, ABA lives in the tree where you learn the important things, among other things. FEDLs and a lot of DIR, lives in the trunk to a large degree, with these individual differences being things we work on. Not a bad tree. So maybe I'll be quiet and let Cynthia talk some more.
Well, segueing on that, I just want to say that the contemporary ABA, okay, so we're not talking about discrete trial ABA, because that's not really ABA. Discrete trial is a way of getting to ABA. But when you talk about ABA, especially those of us that call ourselves contemporary ABA therapists, we would say that our goal is working on the regulation and the engagement. And sometimes we have to put the foundation together for some of those things because we call it learning to learn. So we look at, like, even what I call compliance. It isn't compliance to do something just because I want you to do it, but it's compliance as an interaction. I want you to comply so that you are interacting with me. So we're having an interaction. Okay? In other words, we always look at, when we're starting a model with a child, when I have one come in my office, or I'm in somebody's home like I was yesterday, and I'm looking at, okay, Are they aware that others are in the room? Are they referencing others? Do they have that social piece that's kind of good? So I see what you're talking about here, down in here, with that piece being so important, but it comes to, like you were saying, it goes to this social interaction. And so I look to see, are they referencing? I look to see if they aren't referencing, what am I going to do to teach them that? Okay, the whole thing about eye contact. I had this conversation in an IEP meeting yesterday. I was like frustrated because they were saying, well, he has eye contact. The teachers that had done the assessment of this little guy said, yeah, he has eye contact, but most of the time he's looking like this and he's answering your questions, but that's still good eye contact. I said, excuse me, eye contact is social referencing. It's knowing, oh, you're the person who's talking, you're giving me some information. When I look in your direction, you know I'm thinking about you. That's a whole social thinking piece. Okay, so we look at that as we pull it and bring it all together. I think that there's been people that have done more robotic type of ABA and called it ABA and not just pure discrete trial, which is, no, you're going to do it the way I want you to do it, and you're going to do it now, and I'm going to do mass trials of it and millions of it, and do it like that. So I think there's a bigger bridge to ABA that even goes down into your trunk when I'm looking at the way that I look at the behavioral piece. It's how you get to it.
Which is why I love working with you. Today I saw a couple of different classrooms. I was going out with a family to look at placements, and in one particular class, which I guess I can't really name, even if it was very local to here and public, I saw a model teacher. At least she was put out as a model teacher. And you know what? I think she was doing a splendid job of showing the kids the information, running them through the information, and then rewarding them with electronic games. But there was no real connection, really. There was this sort of sing-song voice from the teacher, being a teacher, when the really interesting thing to me, and maybe you could comment on it, was when she was showing the kids to do some brain gym stuff. Brain gym, pretty good stuff. She was showing them on a diagram rather than doing brain gym and allowing them modeling and being part of an interaction. It wasn't there at all. It was just point, point, point. She turned it into this left brain kind of thing. And I thought, I don't want to be that kid. But there were 3 other aides in the class working with other kids. And there was one kid in the corner who apparently was the hardest one, because he was the one who's usually one-on-one. And he was so happy. And he was so happy because the aide that was working with him was combining, blending what I love, which is affect, warmth, engagement, with kind of a boring math task. But because there was a clear connection between these people, he was happy to be doing this with her. And when he was given the option of doing his favorite games while she was trying to do some charting, he didn't really want to do the game. He wanted to just interact with her. He was just initiating interaction. I was like, whoa, I want to be that kid. That's who I want to be working with. I mean, so it was sort of executed in a way where she was paying attention to referencing, paying attention to the warmth and the engagement. It was just gorgeous.
Well, and in ABA principles, you can start with something more tangible because these are individuals that are more interested in the object or the tangible thing. But you can become part of whatever is that tangible thing. So if they're more interested when they're younger, if they're more interested in something that spins, you can be part of it and be part of taking a turn. You can, exert yourself, put yourself into the equation and be part of the reinforcement. So when we talk about reinforcement, it's not popping M&Ms in somebody's mouth. It's actually us being a part of that reinforcement. And that's how you make, Evan says this a lot. He's a young man with Asperger's that will say, what we need to do is we need to make the social interaction be reinforcing. Mm-hmm. And we can only do that if we're doing something, he says, from the Aspie mind. He says if we're doing something we really enjoy doing and we are having a social encounter that allows us to feel successful. Mm-hmm.
That's how I think of it too. We want to hook people on the interaction, on the relationship with us.
But there might be some incremental steps that we need to get to that. Mm-hmm. But that is ultimately what we're trying to do. So there's an interaction. Now, Tony Atwood says Asperger's doesn't exist if you're in a room all by yourself. Because so much of what happens in autism and Asperger's syndrome happens as a social issue. And if you don't have anybody else in the room with you, if you're with your mind, you know, your own thoughts, your video games and everything like that, there isn't an issue.
Well, that's a sweet thing to say, but I know way too many people who spend way too much time alone in rooms and can't feed themselves because of it.
Yeah.
Just can't keep a job. We have a number of kids we share, and it's one of the things that Cynthia has done for me in the past few years is she's allowed me to work with a number of the people who work under her, working with kids in the school. So when on a real lucky day, I get to have a phone call with a person who's working with a child at a school, and I get to kind of wax DIR with this Cynthia person, and they're working and coaching the school in a blended manner. And although we don't want to give any identifying information about specific clients, we do have permission, I think I emailed you, from one particular family to talk about the kinds of situations we've run into and to think about how our different viewpoints might blend. Okay. So if you want to
and then we thought after we talk about this one, you can actually ask us questions and we'll give you two different, perhaps, perspectives on it.
They might not be so different. But
I
go
don't
ahead.
think they are as different. Some people like to think they are. So give an example. I haven't seen him in the school.
Okay,
so give an example.
Here's one of the situations that came up, and we were kind of thinking through. Nice kid. Oh, nice kid. You know these guys. I mean, the sweetest little guy. But not particularly able to engage in a complex way with other kids on the playground. So very lucky that this child is now out on the playground and wants to play with other kids, but gravitates towards who?
Adults.
The bad kid, actually, in this case. So the affectively charged kid who is a little bit more likely to try to run things, and so our kid is kind of the follower, this kid's like the leader, and the interaction is very linear. So he's following around, and they're kind of talking about various things a little bit. To look from afar, or actually to look close up, you might say, oh, he's got a friend, he's interacting, what a great thing. And if you pull back on the picture a little bit, you're like, oy, who is he hanging out with? I mean, you don't want to disparage somebody else's kid, but it's not the kid you want this one hanging out with. And then when you look at the richness of the interactions of the others, and then what's the quality of the staff in terms of facilitating something that's a little bit more healthy in terms of development. So now we finally come to the situation very recently where the other child encouraged and successfully encouraged our child to do something bad, to fib about something, actually in class I think it was. And so, what do we do now? So that's the situation.
So something happened out on the playground, and when it came into the classroom, he told a story about it?
I think it was more the, I think he lied about work in class, but it was based on their relationship which developed on the playground, in which he was kind of following this guy around and really identifying with him, and so this kid now has influence over him. It's vulnerable, ours is a vulnerable child, and now the kid says, fib or lie about something, and he lies about it. So there you go.
What
Volley
grade?
to you.
What grade are we looking at?
I'm sorry?
What grade student?
Yeah, second grade?
Grade.
Yeah, second grade.
A little one. Well, first off, I want to celebrate that he even thought about fibbing, because lying is a social skill that you think about, because you have to think about somebody else wants to hear an answer different than what's the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So part of it is I do kind of celebrate that he did lie.
They're here.
Inside. But I'm more concerned on a different level that this older kid, or this other kid, is taking advantage of him, and I would want to do some self-advocacy a little bit with him, and being able to say, I don't want to do that, and being okay with saying to the other kid, no, I really don't want to do that. That isn't something that I want to go in and do. I mean, I'm kind of thinking from
Yeah,
that
I mean,
side,
I think he knows
knowing
it's
his kid.
wrong, but he feels like unable to advocate. I think you're right.
Is there a true, what is the attraction between our little guy and...
I think it's this guy's power and energy. It's sort of charismatic. And it's not reciprocal. The kid says jump, our kid says how high, for the most part. They do a little Angry Bird play, which might count for somebody coming up with a little bit. but I don't think that's the general direction of things. Yeah. So we're working so hard on hoping this kid will develop relationships, and the one that he picks, of course, he gravitates towards
is the one that's going
this.
to take advantage of
Right.
it.
Yeah.
But it could be a learning moment for him to learn, like I said, a little bit about self-advocacy. The other thing is that I've had adults tell me that one of the things that they did is when they had an awareness of their social challenges, they would actually look for the kid at school that they thought was the most popular. Now, of course, it goes from what they thought was the most popular. And this, he's a little young, but I've had this situation where they then emulate that behavior because they think that's the popular behavior and that's going to make them be popular. I even had a 6th grader that did it to such an extent that he didn't want to be considered a brain or a geek anymore, so he actually emulated the stoner group. He got himself in 6th grade. In this particular elementary school, there was a lot of drugs that were going on, and he got into that group, all because he wanted to be the popular kid.
Mm-hmm.
So it makes me kind of
I think that makes a lot of sense. I mean, even with our littlest kids, we know that, I mean, just from child development, that people identify with the strong people in their life. And I think that's very much what's happening. So I don't think it's conscious, but I do think that's a lot of what's happening. The energy of this child attracts, you know, what happens with our kids, right? They respond sometimes more to the higher affect of, you know, somebody who's more kind of strong in their personality, and I think that's a lot of what's happening. So a lot of, you know, what we hope to do from the, I guess the DIR developmental side is, you know, first to do more facilitation on the playground and kind of watching what's going on, to bring in more kids and facilitate that. So we're developing his range of people who he can comfortably interact with, not so much to totally exclude the other kid, the kid who's getting him into trouble, but to try to normalize it a little bit and sort of develop out of that sort of linear, one-sided kind of relationship.
And I would think about some of the goals that I would give to him, ways that he can say if things, I don't know, I just think self-advocacy. That's what I would almost be working on, putting a program together to help him to be able to say to somebody when he doesn't want to do something, or if somebody's not doing something. You know, if he says jump, and he can look and say, wait a minute, you're not jumping and I'm jumping. Let's figure this out together.
It's almost like bully proofing.
Yeah.
Yeah. You have a couple thoughts on bully proofing?
Yes. 3 thoughts. 1, we have to teach them the insincere bully. They can pick up the physical bully and they can sometimes figure out the verbal bully, but they do not usually pick up what we start calling the insincere bully. We've called it in the past the taking advantage of bully, but they don't understand that. And the other thing is that this is was so powerful to me. We did this whole lesson in Friends Club one year on mean teasing versus friendly teasing, and one boy came into group and his mom told me a really, really uncomfortable story about how he was pushed down in the mud and all the stuff that had happened out on the playground. And when his mom said, well, what was going, you know, something about, was it a friend? What? And he says, well, yeah, because as he was pushing me down, he was smiling.
Oh, man.
And what I've realized is our kids are looking for a cue on whether or not somebody is being mean or friendly, and they're looking for a cue as smiling. Well, guess what? The bully smiles as they do something to you. The other thing that we look at, too, that I try to teach them is that the person, if somebody has done something to you that causes you to get in trouble, you need to look at what are all the other cues. For example, I will actually tell kids, bullies figure out that if I kick you under the table, you're going to react above the table and the teacher's going to see it. And you're going to be in trouble for it. So we talk a lot with the kids about kids that are insincere bullies, the mean teasing versus the friendly teasing. So that's one for the older kids that can cognitively understand that. The other thing is they have to tell somebody. These are kids that usually do not tell anybody that these things have happened. And so we tell them they have to tell somebody. They have to find an adult to tell. And then we also want to tell them to say something to the bully. And the research with Carol Gray a number of years ago in 2001 when I sent her some of my research, the research indicates that we've told kids to ignore the bully. Well, guess what we know in bully research? You ignore, you get bullied more. if you don't say anything, if you just walk away. So we actually teach the kids, you need to have something to say. They, you know, your shirt's ugly, so what? And then walk away. There has to be something said to that person. And then a bully proofing is hanging out with other kids on the playground, because they're only going to pick on the kid that's by themselves. So if you
Lovely, beautiful. Yeah, from the other side, I often mirror a lot of that. I love the Carol Gray work on that as well. And if I can only do one thing at a school to make life better, it's to get more adults out there who are actually watching. So supervision turns out to be one of the most important things. But the other thing is, if you've heard of DIR floor time, you've maybe even read about some of these developmental approaches, a lot of times you hear about the term playful obstruction. Anyone heard about that? It's when you're trying to get into somebody's world, and there are a lot of techniques for trying to get into their world. And one of the buzzwords or buzz phrases is playful obstruction. It's getting in the way of the child, but in a playful way. However, as it turns out, we all have kind of aggressive streaks in us, more or less, and sometimes it gets a little out of hand. And playful obstruction, even on the part of a well-meaning play partner, adult or somebody, sometimes is a little bit like bullying. Right? You're taking it away. So I think we have to be very careful about playful obstruction. I think it's important to try to insert yourself and to be nice about it, but to really ask yourself, am I being helpful? I know the child doesn't really want me there, but I really want to be there. Am I being more like a relatively benign golden retriever, or am I being a little bit more mean about it? Because it's very easy to fall into that, and it's even kind of fun in a way, but it can enact a bullying kind of thing. And you don't want to teach the child to have that pattern of interaction, because just like any abusive relationship, they can go find it, they identify with it, and they find it out on the playground. So you have to be careful about that. At the same time, at its best, this kind of interacting with kids gives them more of a richness and an ability to see what a good and playful teasing is versus something that isn't. So hopefully it feels good and warm and rich. And one of the best ways to sort of help yourself be engaging in productive kinds of interactions and obstructions and things like that is to be talking about what you're doing with somebody else. I talk about my cases with other people, without identifying information, all the time. I don't trust myself to know everything, and so I have mentors or I have colleagues, and we kind of talk about what that interaction was like. We do a lot of videotaping. I know you do a lot of the same. It keeps it open, honest, keeps things kind of on the level. But again, getting back to what Cynthia was saying, you really, from my point of view, you really want to give kids a very rich array of interactions, as opposed to teaching someone to turn on what, say, so what or whatever, turn on one hill and go tell an adult. That's good. It's an important skill. It's up here. You also want to be sure that they have the number of experiences and richness of experiences with other people, not just the same experience over and over in practice, so that they get a sense of the broad, infinite, really, number of ways in which any interaction can unfold. That's one of the things that is a contrast, I think, to the old DTT, where there was trouble with generalization. You would teach someone to do something, and then it wouldn't generalize, like, go up, shake hands, say your name, and ask what your favorite color is. When people do that, it doesn't work, right? Because it looks like they have 3 eyes. So we want things to be a little different every time, not the same thing all the time. Is that?
Yeah, that is so important, because these are individuals that like patterns. So if you do something in a very, we call them behavioral sequences, if you do them in a very specific pattern, they're going to want to always do it in that particular pattern. So we're constantly changing things up. It's funny, because if I find that kids always, like coming in for the ed program, they always do something the same way, I'm going to go back and say, all right, we need to change it up a little bit. Like if I learned in Friends Club, if I did a schedule, and every time the schedule had, it was always book and snack. Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'd have read a book, and there'd be our little gummy snacks. And I found that the kids would get to depend on that in the schedule. So I stopped putting it in the schedule. And then we got, no book and snack. Oh, we're going to have a book, but there may not be a snack tonight. Oh my God, there's no snack tonight. Well, yeah. Guess what? Sometimes we'll have something, sometimes we won't. And just teaching them to be flexible, even within something that they're kind of depending on, that there's a bit of a flexibility. What can we say about it? How can we work that out? How can we negotiate that? So much of what we do socially is negotiating with somebody else.
And you're very thoughtful about that. You know, back in the day, you know, probably 20, 30 years ago when we were starting out, people said, these kids need, what they would say, finish the sentence, right? These kids need predictability, right? Because that's what made them more comfortable. But of course, what we know is that if you make someone too comfortable, they get more uncomfortable with any change. And so they become more narrow and narrow and narrow in their ability to tolerate the everyday changes in life. And so my rule of life is that nothing ever happens as expected. You've got kids who, they want things to happen the way they expect, and when they don't, they freak out, they have trouble. We're like, no, we don't want to upset them, so we make it how they want it, and then our lives become, you know, very constricted. So in order to somehow break that up, one way I try to think in my head and pass it on to other people is this idea that nothing ever happens exactly as expected. We have a plan, it's a plan. It's like Carol Gray, but kind of in everyday life, right, in everything you do. We have a plan, like I plan to come up here and talk, and then probably go home and pet the new dogs. We just adopted dogs, lovely dogs. But you know, I don't know that it'll happen that way. It probably won't happen that way. We're going to the park again. We go to the park every day, but it's always a little bit different. And being aware of the weather's a little bit different, the people are a little bit different. It's not exactly the same. It's never exactly the same. Now that's hard for some people to think about when they've been trying to make everything the same their whole lives. But if we think about it, if we realize that, maybe we can somehow seep that in to some of our kids and clients over the years, so that they're able to understand and be okay with and even embrace the idea that it's a little bit different every time, but as Carol Gray would say, that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Now, taking that whole idea, we call it change-ups.
Okay.
Okay, so taking that whole idea and looking at it from a behavioral point of view. Okay, I want to teach generalization, I want to teach that we can have change-ups. From a behavioral point of view, you can change something on the antecedent side, which is what happens just before the behavior, or you can do something with the consequence side, which is what happens after the behavior. So, for example, if every time, if you're in the store with your child and every time you walk past the candy, they're screaming, I want M&Ms, and your thing is to finally give in, that's on the consequence side, because you've done something that is going to keep that behavior going. When I look at change-ups, I look at the antecedent side. So I look at how can we prep them. So even with the whole thing of book and snack, yeah, it was like, okay, we're going to try this out tonight. Of course, I got a lot of behavioral issues over it. So the next week, what did I have? I wrote up at the top of the board, we might have a snack tonight, we might not have a snack tonight, it will be okay. And then we talked about it, we practiced it. When I'm thinking of your son today, there was going to be somebody else in his session at home. So as he was leaving from our ed program, I wrote him a little note. Today when I get home and I play with Tiffany, there'll be a friend with her. Her name is Janine, and we will have fun. So he could go out the door with this visual and go home with it with the reminder. That's antecedent side of it. So that's how we can prep the kids, and I love using visuals that way because that really helps them. That's kind of putting it into that whole antecedent side. The other piece of it is then the practicing of it. And that's where we're going to do something on the consequence side. We've got to change something about the way that we're doing it. And I like how you said earlier, a lot of times when we're working on either DIR or the ABA side of it, it's what we do. It's how we look at what we're doing. So when you're looking at a behavior that you're trying to change, it usually means you need to do something in order to change that behavior. Whether you're going to prep on one side or you're going to change your reaction on the other side. Way to kind of look at it. Putting in and changing. We call them change-ups. And we even have a whole thing about how change-ups are okay.
Lovely. Well, if you want a happy dog, you have to have an owner who knows how to have a happy dog. Right?
That's right. I watched the City Dogs or something. This new dog show was on TV last night. My daughter was watching in New York City. He's a dog trainer.
Oh, yeah.
Dog TV? Have you seen Dog TV?
Dogs in the City.
Dogs in the City.
Oh, Dogs in the City.
I only remember the commercial. I've never seen it. But
With that, let's open this up a little bit interactively because we've got a bit more time.
Speaking on that same note, 18 months ago, before I even met you, Cynthia, or Case, I remember sitting with Dr. Fader talking about that same little guy, and our parting conversation was, how do we teach him the concept of maybe? Like, he has to understand maybe. Like, maybe it'll happen, maybe there'll be snack, you know? And so I went in my play sessions, because I was doing a home program myself back then, and really working on, before I knew the word change up, just in a playful way, playing with Maybe, and he got that. Like, he totally got, hey, this is a 2-hour playroom session. It's going to be okay 2 hours from now. I can get out of this room and go back to my routines, and, you know, and so it was great prep. And then with our home program, too, from Case, we started, like, okay, in practical real life, where are we having issues with the Maybe? And it was shopping. It was taking him to the store, and to him, every day meant we were going to buy something. And I'm like, I can't afford to go on errands with him because I can't. When he has a tantrum, it's pretty dramatic. So we started with just that because it was practical in real life, and we broke it down, and we made a visual, and we made a social story, and we went through 2 disastrous initial trips. Not disastrous. I was feeling confident, like, we've explained it, we've practiced it, we've played it in a way not so high, you know, reward. I mean, he wants what he wants when he wants it. In the playroom, he had already developed sort of that flexibility from all that practice. But there in the store in Barnes & Noble with the Sonic Sega thing, he's like, I need to have that 5 minutes ago, you know? So, and it's been amazing. Laura helped me with all the visuals and the experience of doing it. And so the combining for me of the two, like, to take this approach in my trusted relationship with him and really work on that concept, and then through an ABA program to kind of generalize that to these situations, and for me to have a kind of even for me to have the order of, here's how we're going to do it, here's how we're going to prepare him, here's what we're going to do when it happens, you know, whatever. It's been amazing. I don't even have to use the money. I mean, he understands, and now we're at the level where at least. And then that's generalized faster, because that was the big ticket thing, you know what I mean? But now we can talk about it.
I had this interesting consultation the other day. It wasn't, usually the consultations when the clients come in on Tuesdays or new client days, it's, does my kid have Asperger's, does my kid have autism? That's usually what they're coming in the question. This was completely different, kind of threw me for a loop, because you can never know what's going to come in the door and what to expect. And it was a school anxiety. And progressively over the last 4 or 5 years, this kid had gotten so he wasn't going to school on Mondays. And then it was such a struggle to get him to school the other days, but he would kind of make it, and then the weekend would come, and then, okay, and to the point that he just refused to go to school. So I'm listening to him, okay, so this is what you want help with. As I'm watching the younger sibling play with one of my interventionists in the other, out of the corner of my eye, going, your younger one I'm a little concerned about. But I'm listening to it, so I said, so what you're here for is to get some help with this. And so we talked about anxiety, because we haven't even touched that whole piece, because the anxiety is really the underlying cause of it. So we talked about the anxiety, and so I said, well, here's what I would, so I'm kind of going, okay, this is a little different, it's not about a diagnosis, which is kind of cool. And I said, we need to desensitize. Because they were talking about doing homeschooling and all these different things to do, and I go, well, you can homeschool and you can keep him home, but then you're going to, you know, when he's 18, 21 years old, you're going to come back and tell me you can't get your kid out of the house. Mm-hmm. So I said, it's all about kind of desensitizing and finding a way to do it. And I said, that's what I would really focus on. I wouldn't focus on how am I going to, like, deal with this and find, you know, bring him into home. And Dad looked at me and goes, what do you mean by desensitizing? And I said, oh, well, let me explain. It's perfect. We've got summertime. He doesn't have school that he's going to. Let's find a class that he really wants to take, some camp, whatever it might be, and let's enroll him in it. And I said, but wait a minute, I haven't finished, because I said we've got a whole lot of prep to do, but what I want to do is I want to bring that out as a success, something that he can go and do that is like school, so it's got to be like a class, so that what we can do is we can, at the end of it, we can say, you've done it, you've been successful, because Evan keeps telling me they've got to have the experience of the social success. And Dad goes, how are we going to do that? And I go, well, we're going to do all kinds of prep for 2 to 3 weeks before he goes into that class. We're going to do social stories. We're going to do practice of it. We're going to do some role play of it. We're going to, talk about it. We're going to experience it. We're going to do all of these things. We're going to take him to that place where the class is going to be. We're going to show him, the physical environment without anybody else there. And he went, wow, that's a lot of work. And I said, yes, but it can be worth it in the end if you can get him to school, because that's what he ultimately needs to do. And I said, as a behaviorist, I've got that goal out there. I know you've got that goal for your
Yes, I do.
And I've got that goal out there for him to be participating in society. But if we just say, okay, we're going to give into all this school anxiety, you're never going to get to that goal. So it's going to be a lot of work. Mom glommed onto it. We're going to meet. She's going to plan the place. We're going to, and Evan's on board. He's going to help. We're going to go. He's going to look at it from a sensory perspective of what's going on and whatever it is, and how we can help with that anxiety. But that's kind of what I mean. So this is kind of cool, because what I'm seeing, we don't practice any of this, but what I'm seeing is you're talking about all of the relationship piece, and I can come in and say, here's all the steps we're going to get to that.
I think that's lovely. In fact, when people come in and say, you know, my kid's not going to school anymore, I try to explain to them that that is, you know, truly an emergency. You think about one of us not being able to go to work. You know, what do we do with people who can't go to work because they're so anxious? We hospitalize them, and we do a lot of things to try to help them get back. And I ascribe wholeheartedly to that kind of approach that you're talking about, Cynthia. I look toward what will be, you know, the kind of thing they want to do. I try to think about who's, you know, kind of connected and close with the person to help walk them towards that. But it's just so important. And one thing I really avoid, it just burns me up when my medical colleagues, you know, I'm a physician, do this, is I really tell people to avoid Valium class medicine, Xanax, Valium, Librium, you know, those kinds of things. Why? Because it interferes with learning as well as motor planning, and it friggin' hooks the kids on the medication. They don't get better, they just get hooked. It is a real problem. It's easy to get these medicines. It's very problematic. Other medicines, if you have a good plan like this and it's not going well, sure, maybe. But you need a good plan. You don't just try to give a kid a pill for anxiety. Huge mistake. But unfortunately, the way the system's set up, it rewards doctors for giving out pills. So you go to your pediatrician and say, you know, gee, my kid's anxious, sends you, either gives you medicine or sends you to a psychiatrist who has a few minutes and says, oh, here's a medication. Wrong, 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 wrong. I teach about medications. I love medications. I think they're life-saving at times. But you get a good plan. Medicine helps a good plan work better sometimes. You do the plan first.
Let's talk about anxiety, especially along the spectrum.
I'm a little nervous about that, but okay.
What do you think is the root? What do you think is kind of the foundation of that anxiety?
Well, if I had to say just one thing with my hand tied behind my back, it's being like, you know, an octagonal peg trying to fit into a round hole. I mean, just the world doesn't fit right, and it freaks you out. That's what I think.
And I believe there's a sensory foundation to that, because so much of it, and Cecilia, who's our OT that works with us, she's upstairs, she talks about it because she talks about how all of the foundations need to be in place, and if those things aren't starting to be in place as the child's growing, they're going to have a lot of those sensory issues. And I do agree, it's the awareness. Another one today I was saying to the mom, when your husband, ex-husband, is on board with this diagnosis, we have to tell your 12-year-old daughter. The first thing we have to do is we have to tell them that this is what she has.
And how do you do it is really, you know, part of the art.
How you do it is part of the art, but it's not as scary as people think it is, because you're dealing with a person with a spectrum difference, and so they see the world differently. They want it black and white. They want to know what it is, who else has it, and usually that is enough for them. It is absolutely liberating. I have parents bring kids to me all the time. Okay, Cynthia, you have to be the one. I'll tell a funny story. So this mom, we were in the other office, and I had already diagnosed her son a couple of years prior, but she had decided that they weren't going to talk the diagnosis. So finally she calls, I should see her on my appointment, and she says, it's time. It's time for what? And she comes in, it's time to tell him. Okay. But I have to know, what are you going to say? How are you going to say it? What are you going to say? What are all the components to it? Okay. So I sat with her in my office and I said, I talk about the thing thinkers and the people thinkers. I talk about different ways of thinking. talk about different ways to approach different things and how we're in a world full of people thinkers, and if we're thing thinkers, we've got to figure out how people thinkers think. Talk about Einstein and Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Edison and all the people that you can talk about. And she
Tesla.
said,
Don't forget Tesla.
and Tesla.
Nikola Tesla, man. Okay, sorry.
Help me.
Is that a new one?
Edison's nemesis, but really Tesla was the hero and Edison was the bad guy. I'll tell you later.
Okay, so and I make it, so she says, okay, so that's how you're going to, I said, yeah, but it'll probably go a little quicker with your son. Okay. So her son comes in, sits down, looks across at me, and I said, do you know why I'm here? He says, not really, but my mom said you have something to tell me. And I said, well, it's about how you think about things. Remember a couple years ago when I did all that testing? Well, there's a name for what you have. It's called Asperger's syndrome. It sounds like hamburger, but it's Asperger's syndrome. It is. And I said, you know what it really basically is? Think thinkers versus people thinkers. And he goes, oh my God, I'm a think thinker. I said, yeah, that's what it is. He says, thank you. I can go now. And I went, oh, well, wait a minute, do you want to hear about all the different people? He says, oh, yeah, I got an idea. Is it like Thomas Jefferson's Bill Gates like this? People that make computers? And I said, yeah. People that design video games? Yeah, absolutely. Okay, cool, no big deal. Stands up, and as he goes to walk out the door, he says, now, will you deal with my little sister? So the mom comes in. But even Evan, when I told him when he was, I think he was 15 or 16 when we talked about his diagnosis, I mean, he says it's very liberating. Then you know you're not a freak. You're not, there's something to be described. This particular reason why I want this 12-year-old girl to know is she is so uncannily aware of all of her social difficulties, that what she is doing is when mom notices something that happens and mom tries to talk to her about it, she's completely denying it. Because what she's doing is she's trying to say it never existed. And that worries me more psychologically about how she's going to be able to carry on if she's so trying to put that out of her mind because she's so aware how socially awkward she is. And she'll let you know that she knows that there's social things that she doesn't quite get, but she will deny that she is not, that she has these challenges. And I want her to understand how she thinks in that awareness piece.
And we should talk about that. We should talk about depression. For
Yes.
people who are more socially active, more verbal, who are trying to be part of, just life. They want to be dating, they're having trouble, whatever. Sometimes sometimes the way in which Asperger's or autism is presented, but just sometimes the way life hits them makes people very, very discouraged and depressed, and they feel pretty bad about having what they have. And I certainly treat a lot of people with depression, suicidality, stuff like that, which to me is much more dangerous than people who are pretty determined to do what they want to do. So occasionally we have some really difficult situations, and some of that you can kind of hark back to the delivery of the news, not done so with the finesse that you describe, and I love hearing how you do it. I'm going to steal that.
It's a chapter in my book, too.
Oh, I've read your book, so I should remember that. Anyway, but it's not necessarily just the way the news is delivered, it's the way life is delivered. Can be just very, very discouraging. And depression is important to treat, because once your brain gets depressed, it learns how to be more depressed. And it is treatable. And medicine therapy, all kinds of things, including cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, which works actually quite well for people on the spectrum.
What did you call that?
Cognitive behavioral therapy for depression is really well described, and especially adolescent teens who we work with, a lot of times it's really easy to kind of pick up the rules of how you kind of change your thinking in certain situations, and I've got people who are better at that than just everyday other people coming in for that kind of treatment. They're more compliant actually in a lot of ways because they want the help and
they're motivated
follow
for
the
the
rules.
help, and they want to know what the steps are. And
Yeah.
if they can see the steps and they can make the goals, then they'll work towards it.
Boy, it can make your life a lot happier to kind of change disordered thinking. That said, when a bad thing happens, you know this, right? When a bad thing happens, you remember it. A lot of our friends, neighbors, relatives, whatever, with ASDs remember it way too well. And when you get depressed, you tend to overgeneralize. So this restaurant was bad. It will be bad forever. It wasn't just that incident. Or going to restaurants is bad. Or going out is bad. You know, it can get a little bit globalized. So you have to be careful about that. But there's ways to combat it. And again, ways from the relationship side, but I would pair them with the cognitive side. I wouldn't do one without the other. Ever, really. I think they both go together quite well. You guys must have things you want to talk about.
Tons. I mean, my mind is just piling up. As, you know, I met Cynthia, you know, years ago, and she's instrumental in getting my son the placement that he much needed, and he's been there ever since. But now he just turned 13, and you said something very important earlier about telling an adult about bullying. I mean, now he's at a point where he verbalizes a lot more about stuff that's happening out in the playground. And you talked about, you know, this is a difficult age where it's hard for them to tell a grown-up, even though, because of just where they are socially. And again, he's so aware that, you know, it's like, gee, you know, that's kind of difficult. Maybe okay to teach a younger kid, you know, to tell a grown-up because that's very acceptable. But with this age, that's more difficult. I was hoping to hear a little more on that.
You know, you bring up a really good point, because it's not just about telling a grown-up, but it's telling a trusted grown-up that is going to actually try to resolve it. What I am finding with some of the adults that I'm working with is that some of the issues that they're having are over unresolved bullying episodes that happened to them. So there was no resolve. So this happened, they knew something was going on, they didn't know who to go to talk, they don't go necessarily to talk it out, okay, and then it is unresolved. So one of the things that they need to have somebody that they're trusted, that they can tell. I like it if sometimes it's mom, because sometimes what I've even done with some of the kids is give an opportunity for them to go to mom and say, hey mom, this happened and I'm not really sure how I was reading it. It all has to do with how we process it. Or a trusted adult at the school or whatever. But the point is that they have to go tell somebody, because they're not going to be able to do something about it on their own.
And I just want to add a piece to that. You're right. Because he's been taught all these strategies, he did tell a grown-up, me. And so based on what I know and I learned, I said, I helped him. Well, you know, this is what you can expect and not expect, and let's work it out and try it. And he did. And the kid did something very odd, which is bring another friend in to jump into the bullying. So at that point, it's like, I don't know how to solve that. I'm going to have to tell the director of the school. That's how I solved it, because I ran out of strategies to help my son cope with the situation. So, you know, that worked out, and that's over and done with. But when you said that, it's like, you know, this is one situation because of the environment he's in that it worked. But he's going to be entering high school, in 2 years. That's the whole game's going to change in being able to tell a grown-up.
There's a couple things about that I think are worth picking up on. One is that you're, you know, astute in terms of developmentally. Kids start listening to adults less as they get older and start listening to their peers. It's, you know, it's a developmental thing. If you think about life in human communities 100,000 years ago, 13, 14, you're kind of on your own by then. You're working with your peers at that point. Maybe you got kids, you know? I mean, it's not a shock that people aren't really listening to their parents as much by age 14 or 15, something like that. The other thing is that a lot of our kids are much more accustomed to, almost groomed to be reliant on us, so they might be a little bit more likely to tell a parent, which is good. And thank goodness, right? You had somebody you could talk with about it to try to get it resolved. It's so important that we don't isolate ourselves. I'm a parent too, right? That we don't isolate ourselves and sit with these things, but find people to help us when we're stuck. Otherwise, it doesn't go anywhere, right?
Yeah.
So there's that as well. And then finally, the other thing is that most of the bullying that we see, I think, is in like 5, 6, 7, 8th grade. By high school, it's a little bit less. I mean, you've got people who are, some of them are crazy and interested in college already. Some of them are interested in dating. I mean, there's just a lot of other things that are happening. And at the high school level, bullying isn't so much the issue as much as especially in the public schools, people just kind of the school assuming, even for a kid on an IEP, that the child is able to self-advocate when they're not able to self-advocate. And that's where self-advocacy becomes even more important, or just as important. But at the same time, the bullying piece is a little bit less of the issue, my experience.
So just one more year of bullying. Huh?
Well, one hopes.
Well, I mean,
yeah.
but I think it goes even into the workplace. If you're working and if someone says something inappropriate to you, you have that. You can go to your boss or their boss and talk to them. So I mean, I don't think it's bad that they come to you or their teacher. I think you have to get used to that so you can advocate for yourself for the rest of your life if you're treated unfairly. So I don't think it's...
That's a bad thing, but it comes to an age, and being a mother of a 17-year-old as well, that, parents, they want to distance themselves from their parents. So it's like, that's the piece I'm worried about. It's like, yes, he's in 7th grade now. We handled it resolved quickly, no harm, no foul, it's done and over. And it's like, in a couple of years, that's not going to work anymore. Yeah. But if you're telling me that lessons in high school...
It does, but he's got a really good point. I mean, all our people who are adults on the spectrum can have problems at work. Not getting promoted, not really quite connecting with people, maybe getting pushed aside while somebody else's idea gets pushed ahead. So, it is true that these things happen, throughout life. But in terms of sort of the gross schoolyard bully type stuff, it's more what I'm referring to. And I think it's actually more in kind of after school is over, even after college is over, in the workplace is more of an issue because it's not very well monitored. I was in the military for a long time, and I felt like there were certainly times when people were really mistreated. You send someone off on a mission without enough gas to get back. I mean, there's a message there. But for the most part, it was a pretty fair place. When I got into the civilian world, I realized how much more of a dog-eat-dog world it was, even in medicine, for God's sakes, where people were stepping on each other. So I think, the general civilian workplace is probably, one of those places that's really difficult. And while we're accustomed to working in a systems way, we talk to the school, we're coaching people, we're doing all these kinds of things. When you start doing that at somebody's workplace, in our current culture, they tend to get fired. So it's not like you can call the boss and say, gee, let's make these accommodations, let's do this. Most of the time that won't work, unless, of course, you're dealing with a company that gets it that they're hiring people because they're thing people and not people people, and they want the help in working with these thing people so that they can be more able. What?
Like Google.
Like Google. Qualcomm actually does some stuff.
Yes.
Good, that's good to know. And then the other piece I wanted to ask you about is, why do you have to tell a kid their diagnosis? Versus you struggle. This is what's happening in your life, happening to you. You struggle to learn more than your brother does, and that's okay because you're working the way you need to work to accomplish the same thing. You just work with them in their own environment without actually having to label it. That's the part that
the label is more important to you. The label is more concerning to you than it is to your son. I will tell you that from 12 years of running case and telling kids, I've only had one that was really, really upset after it, but it's because his mother was a special ed teacher and worked with kids with autism and got actually hurt by a child with autism. So he had a different connotation because it falls on the autistic spectrum. But the label is more concerning to you than it's going to be to him. The kids, I haven't had a kid, they'll say, well, we're going to use it as a crutch. What it does is it lets them know that there's a name to the way that they're thinking. I don't know, Melissa, do you want to?
I want to just add that because if you don't tell them, you're really shaming it. You know what I'm saying? Because, well, I mean, my son knows since he was 5, but you just put it in certain words that he can understand.
Yeah,
I'm just saying.
Yeah, you put it in a certain words that he understands.
Yeah,
but without
children,
actually having to
but
say
children are so smart now.
They are.
They know, like, someone that has, like, let's say someone who has a physical disabled, whatever. They know that. There's a name for that. Or so they know. If you talk about Einstein or you talk about whatever Jefferson, those are great people. So it's.
You're absolutely right, but like in a sports setting,
well, you don't have to tell the whole world about it.
You don't do that, but this is what you hear. It's like, oh, my child can't do that because he has autism. It's like, yes, he can. Don't let the label interfere with anything. Yes, work a little bit harder or a little bit different, but don't use that. It's like, I guess that's what I'm trying to convey here. It's like that
But you're
word
telling-
can get in
she
the
just
way.
saying you're telling your child, and your
Yeah.
child doesn't have to go out and tell every single person he meets that he has
Right.
Asperger. Yeah, but it just.
I'm going to come to your aid for a second here. So a lot of parents, and I've seen it happen actually, worry that if their child gets a label that they might be shunned by other kids, they won't get the play dates, et
Or
cetera, et
use
cetera.
it as an excuse, right?
What my experience has been that the differences are creating that already, and that for the child, they don't really understand why. And while I might not sit a child down and say, son, you have autism, I would be much more developmentally appropriate, talking about, how we think about the world. In a way, it's more fair. If you want somebody to kind of understand, who is it? Socrates, right? Socrates, right? Socrates from, what was that movie? Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. They call him Socrates, right? So what did, the guy said, know thyself. If what we're trying to do is to help someone understand themselves, we kind of owe it to them to share with them what we think is happening so that they have the benefit of utilizing that in a way that they can help themselves move forward in the world. It is true that there are people who will take a diagnosis, whether it's a more obvious physical deformity or a neurologic thing going on that's harder to see, and will turn it into an excuse. And that's a problem. There's no question about it. There are plenty of people out on disability who probably, if we work with them a little bit differently, might be more productive tax-paying citizens. I get that, but at the same time, to just set it aside and say we're not going to talk about it, I think puts people in a tougher position and doesn't respect who they are really. So I'm for telling developmentally over time, but at the same time, I understand the anxiety of trying to tell someone or of giving them the news. The hardest part is becoming comfortable with how replete the population is with people who are, a little spectrumy. I mean, it's kind of all over us. I think it's, obviously less of an issue when people are more challenged and we're just trying to communicate with them a little bit and have a productive day. And so it's less of an issue. It becomes the biggest issue, I think, with the people who are the quote-unquote highest functioning when, you're thinking about should we even talk about a difference, or when diagnosis has been controversial. How many times has someone come to one of us where, it just happened to me today, where the school system says, nah, doesn't have it, and then me, maybe Rady on my side as well, saying, well, if you look, it's there, and that's what's getting in the way of, moving forward. Those are the situations where I think it can be the hardest because there's controversy surrounding the diagnosis in the first place.
Right.
So.
You know how I email you about the bullying at school and what the comment was made about I can't take anymore and mention the word Susan. I was wondering if you can address that or.
So she shared an email. She shared in an email that her son, middle school, right? No, not yet. Elementary.
Yeah.
Had done something, and his comment was,
It's been resolved. That I was just concerned about that comment when he was in the moment. He said one of the recess monitor mom, who was a friend of mine, called me and said that apparently the principal forgot to tell me about that, or whoever was involved forgot to tell me about that. But she remembered that. She calls me and said that he said that.
that it had gotten so, he just needed to take care of it because he felt like he was going to.
Well, he says that I can't.
I can't take it anymore.
Yeah.
So the comment is, I can't take it anymore. And it's, to me, it's important to understand what that means. Does that mean, the worst case scenario is, I can't take it anymore, I must act on this right away, I must end my life. I can't take it anymore might also mean, I really don't like what's going on here, can I just go home now? Or can I go to the nurse's office? So understanding it is really important. But let's take it all the way to the max. Let's say that someone is really feeling like it's the end. Our job, I got this model from a guy named Edwin Schneidman, at UCLA a number of years ago, and it's held up really well for me, so I'll share it with you. When someone's feeling really bad about life, and a lot of us, look, it happens. 1/5 of us at least get a major depressive disorder sometime in our lives, and that confers a risk of getting it again, about 50%. And anybody who's depressed can feel suicidal. And of the people who get depression, probably 15% or so actually do end their lives. It's a big, big problem, right? And risk factors for suicide are depression, substance use, particularly alcohol, since it's pervasive in the society, and loss. Loss are the big ones. So we're talking about the whole population, not just people on the spectrum, but that included. And you can imagine somebody on the spectrum might not have that many people they're close with, and so a loss can be a bigger loss. Alcoholism is pervasive in the high-functioning community as well, because you feel better, and it can help, grease the social skids a little bit. So, but then you can be more impulsive and more depressed. But anyway, so there's if you can think in 3D for a minute, there's really kind of 3 axes of difficulty that we can think about. We can think about the amount of pain someone has, and it could be high or low. The press, which is the pressure to do something about it. So you can be in a lot of pain, but not feel like you have to do anything about it, believe it or not. Or feel like, well, I feel like I should do something about it, but I'm not immediately needing to do it. The press is how soon you got to do something. And then the perturbation. I didn't make this up, these are the words he came up with. But by perturbation, it means the number of choices you have. So getting back to my made-up set of possible ways to understand I can't take it anymore, maybe your choices are I can go home, I can go to the nurse's office, I can kill myself. It's a little bit of brainstorming. Maybe a lot of times when people are very, very depressed, they can't think of all those choices. And so our job is to think about all these different things. I'm in terrible pain, the only thing I can do is kill myself. Do we have to do it right now? I mean, because a lot of times these things pass. I mean, it's true. Suicidal moments tend to pass. It's a funny question, right? And one of the reasons that a lot of us at our age with kids will decide not to act right now is because we have kids. So it's one of the main reasons a lot of us keep ourselves alive when we're depressed. Well, who's going to take care of the kids? That's right. For little kids, that's not necessarily always the case. And if you're drinking, you might not care. Pain, what can we do about the pain? Well, that's when we're talking about treatments for depression, including cognitive behavioral therapy for depression, including other kinds of therapies, including medication, including trying to get rid of some problems. The same wise man once told me, if someone's going to kill themselves because they're going to get a B in a course, give them the A. I don't know if we should always do that, but if they're going to kill themselves, I'll give them the A. I don't care. I want them to live, right? And then in terms of helping someone have more choices, there's a term that's popular in psychotherapy these days called mentalization. Might be a Z, might be an S. Not really sure. Maybe in England it's different. So mentalization, the idea is to help people understand that they've got more choices, because there's always more choices, and especially to help them understand that when they're feeling crummy, when they're under a lot of stress. So if you are able to practice mentalization ahead of time, then lots of times when you get into a tough place where you're in a lot of pain and you feel like you have to act, you could have practiced some other choices ahead of time. Change-ups? I'm learning a new word. So that there's something different you can do. Pain, press, perturbation. If you can remember that, it'll help you deal with some of these situations.
I do think that a lot of our kids, though, and it's not that I don't take, I want to kill myself, or I wanted to kill myself, or I couldn't take it too much. It's not that I don't take it seriously. I just don't jump on it with the same immediacy as some people do now. When it happens at school, they've got to take it seriously. So if a kid says at school, I want to kill myself, or I've been thinking about killing myself, or something like that, a lot of times what I have found is that there is another, like you were just saying, is it, I really want to go home right now, I'm really not happy right now, and I really want to go home right now. And I think when I was talking earlier, our kids learn a behavioral sequence or a behavioral pattern. I do this and this happens. And I think our kids learn sometimes when you say, I would like to die, or I want to die over this, that makes people all jump and do something. Okay, so it's more of a behavioral sequence and not necessarily really an ideation. Although I will take everyone somewhat seriously. It's just I don't jump into it immediately and see this person is talking about killing themselves. I want to say, I'm thinking that there's something that you really didn't like, or something you're really frustrated with. And I'll use words like that, and then I'll get into, well, yeah, I really was upset with my teacher, and I wanted to go home. And I knew that if I said, I want to kill myself, the principal would come in, and everybody would come in, and I would be left alone for a moment. Okay? So I always look at it that way.
So you're wise in trying to figure it out. And fortunately, there are people who are learning to do that. What happens, unfortunately, too often is that people say, oh, he just wants something, but they don't take the time to figure it out and do something about it. And the problem with these quasi-suicidal moments is that they are very clearly statistically associated with actually hurting yourself or killing yourself. So what Cynthia says is exactly what you should do. Try to understand it and figure it out, with knowing that you always take it seriously. Not you call the ambulance, but you make sure that somebody competent is assessing it. Yeah?
Isn't there kind of finality about being perturbed? I mean, your mindset is like there's no hope.
Yeah, that's part of the problem. Hopeless despair, there's no other choices. As I was saying before, when people get depressed, they kind of start to think globally, like everything's bad. The world's bad, I'm bad, the future's bad. It's all looking negative. And trying to help someone step back from that takes time, being with somebody, watching over them, trying to help them unpack the moment and slowly step back from the cliff, so to speak. It takes a lot of work.
For our kinds of kids, what I find a great depression buster is letting them be with other kids that think like they do. Okay, so for that 12-year-old girl that I was talking about earlier, one of the things that I was saying to the parents is that we not only do we need to talk to her about what she has and have some understanding of that, but we've got to find a connection to somebody else that thinks like she does. So that there isn't that feeling, I'm the only one that thinks this way. I'm the only one that just can't take it anymore. They have to have some type of a connection, and it gets back to that whole connection to another person and that piece. And so when I get the 14-year-old teen in here, I don't need friends, I'm not coming to this thing you've got called Friends Club, there's no way I'm going to do this. I'll say, I really think you do want to, because a cognitive behavior therapist to me is going to counter that. I really think you do want to, but you've never been successful with it. But here's a place where you're going to meet some kids that think like you do. You think like Einstein. You think like Bill Gates. The other kids here think that way too. And they'll go, okay, well, I'll try it just once. And I've learned to say, no, 6 weeks. Come to all 6 in a session. But it is absolutely amazing to see the kids when they get into a group and there's other kids that think like they do, how much of that I'm the only one really kind of disappears. And that they don't get that opportunity all the time at school because there's so much of a mixture, although there's 1 in 8 supposedly. But
it's hugely important. People need to find their niche, a place where they're comfortable, feel a little bit understood. People are people, spectrum or not.
And back to your question about high school, I think one of the most important things about high school for my kinds of kids is finding a group that they can hang with. So if they're into chess, finding out about a chess club. If they're into, even my son who is not on the spectrum, the best thing about him going to a large Carlsbad high school, even though he got into high-tech high, but he didn't want to go to high-tech high because he wants to play water polo for Carlsbad High School, that water polo team that's his survival in a large campus of 3,200 kids.
That's his hook.
It's his hook into it. My daughter never had that. And my daughter had a lot of bouts of depression in high school. She's got it now that she's in a sorority in college. But I think that's important to think about, kind of what Josh is saying. And then that group is your group you're hanging with. When there's a break, you're hanging with a group of kids. So, thinking about that way. How we got about 10 minutes?
I was just thinking about how my wife makes me play dates. She got me into a book club. It's been great.
See, what kind of play dates my husband will get me into.
Something not autism
Bridge, poker, bridge, some cards.
Other people have thoughts or stuff? You're all tired.
Yeah.
You should have cookies. We should pass around the cookies. When's snack time? That's what I want to know.
I have a question, although I can't really formulate it, but maybe you can just, I don't know, read my mind. My two guys they don't have Asperger's, so they have autistic spectrum disorder, or whatever you label straight up, moderate to severe autism. So when they're little and we're doing a lot of, we actually started in floor time, and then the second boy got diagnosed a year later, and there was no floor time providers through our regional centers, so that's when we met our first ABA providers. So we've been kind of a hybrid family all the way through because of that. So that said, there are times where I think about the perspective from a behaviorist of the behavioral sequence, so that sequence that we worry about, versus from a DIR perspective or a floor time perspective. I'm like, it's it's an opportunity, it's communication. Like Evan went through a phase of throwing everything off the counter, and it's an opportunity, it's a circle, right? So in dancing that dance between, okay, there are things I don't want to allow because I'm already thinking 5-10 years ahead, or just financially I can't replace my dishes that often, whatever.
Ooh, I got the answer.
Yes.
So here's the thing. Floor time doesn't mean doing whatever the kid wants, because they might order 10 pizzas. I mean, you can't do that. There's got to be limits. The point is that if you have places in your life where there is a connection, a flow of interaction, stuff like that, it's going to be a lot easier to set limits in other parts of your life. I quote another Greenspan book. So that first book about the tree, called The Learning Tree. It's a really easy read and it's kind of fun. There's another older book called Playground Politics, where the thesis of the book is, let's do floor time, let's get the connection going, and then you can set limits and get away with it better. Including, we're not to be throwing plates. That's not a good thing to learn. So that would be the straightforward, simplistic answer.
Yeah, and I think, for me, those were the calls I made because we had a dedicated playroom. So I had a place where it was very much a yes sort of floor time environment. You know what I mean? And then in my kitchen when I'm cooking dinner, there had to be rules because otherwise chaos would ensue. I could be accommodating, and when he was nonverbal, and completely didn't know I was in the room, and he came up and initiated, I shut the stove, I stopped cooking, and there was a time, that was 6 years ago. So now we get into situations where I think about him crying at school, and he's got his medical issues, and how do we make decisions about, do we honor its communication, and if he could tell us how bad he felt, would I even send him to school? Do you know what I mean? Versus, and that relationship piece of, I want him to know I'm listening, and whatever, but I don't want to set up that sequence of, okay, every time if you don't want to be here, you just start crying hysterically or get self-injurious, and then mom will come and pick you up. And so for me, I'm still constantly, I tend to make a more, I don't know, I make a day-by-day decision, I guess. I go with my gut. I go with my gut feeling about, where I think he's at, and physically, for instance, and what do I do, but...
I think that's the appropriate way to do it. That's the important way to do it. You're reflective, you're thinking about it, you're probably calling people to kind of bounce it off and say, well, which way do we go on this one? That's the way to do it, to try to understand it and then figure that out. The wrong way, if you would be to say, oh, well, we have to follow his lead all the time. That's silly. Or he has to comply because that's the important thing. That's just as silly. It's, we're in the middle. We're in maybe land.
Finding a balance between the two. Looking at, I think somebody said this a long time ago. When you're a behaviorist, you're an investigator. You're constantly looking at what's making the behavior occur. And I think with your kids and the older son in particular, we always have to constantly be thinking about, there is the gastrointestinal problem, there is the sensory issue that's going on, and there is the potential for a behavioral sequence. And so we're constantly having to think about all of that and pulling all that in.
Into consideration.
See the moment
Two things. So just, I didn't catch the beginning. It's how do you work? You're a medical doctor, and you're a psychologist. So how is it that you say no medicine, but I'm just what's the piece here? What's the missing piece? I don't.
I've been doing this a long time, and I know better than to throw pills at things. But pills can sometimes save a situation if it's set up right already. That's the short.
That's where
version.
you come in. I mean,
Well, I do a lot of stuff. I'm a very lucky guy. I'm very grateful for my job. I get to assess people. I get to go to schools. I was at schools half the morning today. I use medication sometimes, and I get to play with kids, and I do psychotherapy, and I got the best job in the world. I do research, so it's teaching and stuff. So it's a really good job. But yeah. So.
And then the last question is like siblings. I mean, it was one thing when they were younger. It's like, yeah, this is, you know, with your brother. This is how we work. This is what we do. But now that they're older, I mean, does the plan change when kids are older? And
Oh, such a good question. Lots of times, I don't know about you, but siblings get kind of rolled into whatever we're doing. Not all the time, but a lot of the time, because they're part of the family. Because a sibling who isn't giving up on a sibling with challenges is an incredible play partner, and is also an irritant. You know, talk about playful obstruction. This is just obstruction. It's taking your stuff. And what a great way to help interactions go, and to understand them, and to help people deal with difficult moments and emotions. It's just fabulous. But we're all thinking in the back of our heads, as these kids get older, what's going to happen? Is this this less challenged sibling somehow going to have to be the brother's keeper, so to speak, and take care of them? And they may be thinking the same thing. And they may also be thinking, how am I supposed to have friends over when I've got this, you know, sort of kid who isn't doing so good, who might interrupt, or I might be embarrassed? And you know, there's so many issues that sort of creep in. And when this person grows up and thinks about, am I going to have kids who are having these kinds of challenges? It's just replete with problems. I mean, all kinds of difficulties are just part and parcel of being a sibling of somebody on the spectrum. That's the bad news. The good news is that, you know, it's kind of like that poem, you know, Welcome to Holland. As it turns out, you can surf these things pretty well. You can figure out how to move on with your life. If you're a good parent, you don't merely saddle your child with the responsibility of caring for a disabled sibling for life, but you help prepare the way, you get other services involved, and sure, it would be great if they can help, but I think it's, you know, not appropriate to say, yeah, that's going to be your job. That's my cultural value. Maybe other families or other cultures might have a different way of looking at it, but at least in this part of the world, I think it may be hard to do to people. But yeah, it's huge. It's a problem. We have sibling groups lots of times where people can kind of talk about this and think about it and figure it out. Siblings need a lot of support and attention.
they do, very much so.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's a piece that you can
And
get.
they also need something that they can strive for that is unrelated to all the therapies and everything that the other child is getting. So I had this conversation with a family today because they have a daughter that definitely has Asperger's, and then they have a daughter that is completely the opposite, very social, has a ton of friends, is, you know, a great athlete and all this kind of stuff. But that is the younger daughter, and she wants to do everything the older daughter has done. And I said, I actually would separate what they're doing, and if this one's going to go to this, if the girl with Asperger's is going to go to performing arts school, the little one gets to choose her school that she's going to go to, but it's not going to be the same school. And separating, letting them live some separate identities in some respects, as well as being part of the family. It's all about balance. But I think it's important to have that. It's not all these. I see families, and it's just the nature of the different therapies. That sibling has to go to all the different, you know, they sit here in the waiting room for Friends Club, and they, you know, they're trucking somebody off to OT, and they're going, and I want to say, find something for that sibling that's their identity as well. So it's not always, I am the sibling.
And sometimes it's a fine line. Sometimes
Yeah.
you have two siblings and one is, you know, really into science, but it turns out the other one's really into science. So you hope that one picks particle physics, the other one picks quantum physics. All right, so at least they have something that they can have separate identities. It's pretty rare that you're going to find them really doing the same thing, because there's a natural competition that forms. So there's got to be some, there's usually should be some differentiation between the two to allow them to have separate lives. That happens between parents and kids too. I've got a lot of parents who would like their kids to grow up to, you know, be like them, and when the child chooses like the arts instead of the sciences, it's like a big problem in the family. Or instead of going into corporate law, they go into litigation, God forbid. You know, it's a real issue. So these things happen in all families to some degree. Going into psychiatry instead of internal medicine, oh my God. Aren't you going to be a real doctor? Everybody else is quiet. It's been a long day. Getting what you needed, what you thought, what you hoped for? Disappointed? Glad for your donations. You're going to good causes. I can tell you what mine does. We fight for parent choice in Sacramento and beyond, so that parents aren't railroaded to just, you know, like one choice of therapy through the regional centers or through insurance. So it's not about just pushing DIR, although we do push DIR. We push parent choice, parent power to make decisions about their kids. It actually speaks to evidence-based practice. You've heard this term, evidence-based practice, but a lot of people don't really fully appreciate it. The idea behind evidence-based practice comes from about, depending on where you want to look, about mid-1990s, when this guy named Sackett in the British Medical Journal said, look, if you just use an article that tells you that these kids got better or these people got better with this treatment, and that's all you look at, right, then you have to treat everybody that way. And there's a lot, for instance, papers that show that with discrete trial you can teach people colors, you know, who have autism. And by that logic, you would do the same thing. Every kid needs to have discrete trials so that they learn how to point to the right colors. Not necessarily useful, but, you know, the paper says it could happen. So it's not that it's valueless, it's that you got to be thinking. So not just look at the research, the relevant research, but also look at clinical judgment, what makes sense, right? And then, in addition to that, you've got, you know, research that tells you something might work, because you don't want to just go by the research. You've got clinical judgment, but you don't want to use just clinical judgment alone without research, because then you get people with really weird ideas with no research behind them, no reason that they should work, going out and selling them, and it's just bizarre and sometimes dangerous, right? So you want to put these things together, and what do you do with them? Well, we're all about informed consent in medicine. We're supposed to be in healthcare. So you give that to the people making the decision, which ought to be the family, who make their decision based on their culture and values, right? So 3 pieces: relevant research, clinical judgment, family, culture, and values to make good informed consent choices. So what we're pushing for really is evidence-based practice. What a lot of people do is they misuse that term and they try to say, well, only this particular method works. And it's not just in the autism field, it happens in a lot of different fields. And it's because they have an economic interest usually in doing that, or a, I don't know, some belief that that's what always must work. And they're not really looking at current research. And then relevant research has also expanded. We don't just look at randomized controlled trials that might go for a few weeks or something to train somebody to do something. We look at other kinds of trials, because when you look at autism is a great example, since we're all here. Developmental disorders, well, they unfold over decades, and we don't have all the endpoints. So there are other kinds of ways of studying populations when you don't always know the endpoints. Survival studies is a good one. In regular medicine, survival studies is literally that. You know, this kind of cancer, how many people are surviving with this treatment after how many years? Something like that, or smoking, or whatever it is. Survival studies in our world might look like how many people are still in special education after how many years, or have gone on to, you know, something where they've been able to pop up to into something that gives them more opportunities in life. So we can look at those, and we can look at a graph based on, you know, people who got this treatment versus that treatment. But even looking at this treatment versus that treatment is really difficult in our world. Why? Because we're all giving our kids a whole bunch of treatments. And there's never been real studies on what happens when you combine them. In medicine, I'll get to your question in a second. In medicine, if you're taking a pill for a disease, but then you have a different condition and you're taking a pill for another disease, how many studies do you think there are about people taking both of these pills for either of the diseases or both? Rarely happens. And with our kids, oh my God, we're giving them all these things. So what's also helpful are doing things like efficiency studies. So instead of efficacy studies, drug, placebo, who responds. Efficiency studies take all comers, and they follow them over time, and they try to figure out what's going. A similar, not exactly the same kind of study is a multiple baseline study or a single case study, where you've got a single case study. You might do a treatment, stop it for a while, do it again. They call it ABA, but it's not the same ABA. And see if something happens. A multiple baseline study is you've got people maybe waiting on a wait list and other people starting the treatment program, the intervention program, and you're following development with all of them. And for the people who are still waiting versus the people who have already started, you can see differences in whether one group is actually doing better over time. And then when they get eventually into the pack of starting treatment, you can see how long treatment's been going and how much better or worse they are, depending on what happens with the treatment. So all that's to say that there are much more rich ideas about how we look at research and how we study things than a lot of people like to think about. And the National Academies of Science, Institute of Medicine, actually adopted this view of evidence-based practice in 2001. But here it is 2012, halfway through, and you still get people saying evidence-based practice or evidence-based research equals, we've got these studies that show you can do this, therefore that's the only thing you should do. So just be an aware consumer, because the people who do that aren't thinking about you as the people who ought to be making informed decisions. They're deciding for you what should happen, and not even always based on the most current research. Sir.
I was thinking, if you expand on that, are there instances where your clinical judgment supersede or override norms?
Yeah, actually, pretty commonly. I try to think of a good example. I'll give you a great example. The norm in our community, and this is a little bit different example, is that when you have someone with a psychiatric disorder of some sort and they have to be hospitalized, that as an outpatient psychiatrist you give them to the hospital takes them, does what they will, and then you figure out what's going to happen to them afterwards. That's the norm. I don't do that. I follow the person to the hospital, I work with the staff, we work on what's going to happen afterwards. I just sent somebody to residential care on the spectrum, et cetera, et cetera. Not that you want to send people to residential, but that seemed to be the safest thing to do. Temporary residential. Can't really explain it. But the point is that what I'm doing is outlier kind of behavior. And why do I do it? Because if I would have just sent the person there, they would have told the staff at the psychiatric hospital, I'm fine now, I'm not taking the medicine that I think made me act in a suicidal manner, and then they would send him back to me, and I would have the same problem on my hands, a very dangerous situation, and nothing really done about it. So I buck my colleagues when I do that.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, is you're still going to have a system then that's in opposition.
Sometimes you do.
Yeah.
And Regional Center is a great example of a system where people join, they work there, they try to do good, but lots of times we're bucking. It's the same with the schools. I mean, I'm always fighting the schools. But what do you think people went into teaching for? They're trying to help. I mean, it's not like they're bad people, but sometimes you need. It's almost like the American court system. I really like it because it's what's the word for that in opposition? Lawyers and lawyers here. Sorry?
Adversarial.
Adversarial, that's it. I mean, there's two sides, and hopefully the truth bubbles up from that. I think we need that to be able to find your reasonable kinds of responses. Because you can't just go in and say, needs private school all the time. That's not going to work. We're all going to go broke. But what you can do is you can say, look, we got to figure this out. Maybe you've got a program, but maybe we need to provide support to it. So it's not necessarily coming to Cynthia's school all the time, but maybe it's Cynthia's people going into the school and making it happen. Maybe that can work sometimes. So the adversarial system can bring some good out of it, not just camel-type compromises.
But it's so exhausting.
It's really exhausting and expensive.
You mentioned high-tech high and there's high-tech middle. Do they have IEP as well? Do they take kids on the spectrum as well?
Yeah, you get in under a lottery, so they have no idea that your son has an IEP.
Okay.
They cannot discriminate because they have an IEP, but they don't even, the way that you do it is it's just a name and it goes into the lottery.
Right.
And then they call me up and they say, hey, I think this was one of yours.
Well,
They all end up here.
But I'm saying, do you know if they have a good team that
Fabulous.
will work with kids
I've
with
seen
IEPs?
them go above and beyond
Okay,
for kids.
because I want to apply for
The one
for
up
Jordan
here?
in
The one up
December.
here, the one up here, yes, to some extent. The middle school, I think, is still kind of working on, they really need the kid to be identified up here. But the Point Loma ones are all fabulous. I work with
Really?
all of them.
I've had mixed experiences. Maybe it's the clientele who I see, because they usually have seen a lot of doctors before they see me. But a lot of times people will go in with the expectation that because it's sort of a geeky place, geeky kids will do well, and then some don't. And sometimes the team doesn't rise to the occasion.
The issue is, when that happens, the issue is everything's project-based.
Yes.
And you have to talk to them about, my son is going to participate 25% in the beginning, 50% mid-year, and by the end of the year, 75%. So you've got to ease these kids into project-based, because your traditional school system is not project-based. It is everybody for themselves. And everything that high tech does is based upon people working together as a team. I think it's the greatest thing from the population of kids that I've devoted my life to, simply because it's better preparing them for life out there to work. But my nephew, who went through high tech high, got to UC Davis and needed math help because it doesn't drill and kill the math. And when you do get to the university and you're in the sciences, you need a little bit of help with the drill and kill. But he got a math tutor, he's fine.
Yeah, their
Yeah.
score is not like the highest compared to other schools. They're okay.
Not in regards to that, but what I really do like is so much of it is, how are you two going to figure this out? Here's a problem, you got to apply it to it, how are you going to figure it out? And then they're there to kind of help you along with it. But I do find if they're identified, once they get in, so they're not identified before they get in, but once they get in, I've never seen a group of people that I work with that have not gone above and beyond.
I'm sorry, you were saying like 25, 50, and then 75%. Is it because the kids are not?
We got to give them some practice to it. We got to ease them into this whole thing that they got to be doing something that other people are doing. Like I had one
Because
boy
they
that.
don't take initiative, or because they.
No, it's more. It's more about when you're introduced. And I have a boy that did this. He went to San Marcos High School. Was math whiz, the math whiz, and his little niche at San Marcos High School was that he really knew algebra. And in the algebra class, the teacher actually used him as a tutor, which was lovely. I love it. It's like a great idea. He goes to high tech high, everything's applied, he has to work. It's not about proving his math skills. He has to work with somebody else. He has to be able to figure out how to put that in. We had a real depressive episode over all of this. I come in, I say, you know what, I know he's depressed, I referred him to a psychiatrist, got referred out, he got that taken care of. I said, I went to the teacher and I said, there has to be something that he's really, really good at in your class. And he goes, oh my gosh, he's got algebra down like nobody else in my class. I said, have you ever said that to him? He says, well, no. And I said, oh, okay, and do you have a project that he can do that he can actually be kind of a tutor? Oh, absolutely, blah, 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 blah. Next thing you know, the kids do it perfectly fine. So it's about the way that you think about the process.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, we end up training kids to do things, and sometimes they're really bright at doing even complex mathematics, but they don't really understand what it means. They've never really applied it. And the high-tech groups are all about application, which is absolutely critical out in like the real world. And there aren't a lot of colleges that I think do a very good job at that. Kettering is the automotive college in Michigan. I think the Cal Polys, although Cal Poly SLO is really tough on people, it's a high-pressure school. Cal Poly Pomona is its laid-back sister. Still very hard, but they've got some support there. I've had some luck there with a couple kids. Where else? I mean, do you find actual support for people to do that? And these are hands-on type schools, you know, project-based learning, hands-on learning. That's really, really important.
It's not that easy to get anything.
It's not.
Yeah.
And it's based on your zip code.
Very much. So did you come in as part of the school system at High Tech High, or were the parents brought you in?
No, the director of special ed, the one that coordinates all of special ed, knew me from when he worked up in the high desert, and he knew I was an autism expert, and he just keeps bringing me in.
That's fabulous.
Evan one is on the North
Golden.
County campus every Wednesday.
Really?
It's a
Why are
nice
you gonna try high-tech high? Apply for
I think
high-tech
it's,
high? 'Cause
you
you're
know,
there.
I don't think it's the only option out there for high school, but I do like it for our kids that really need to learn that working with other people.
Because they can't all get in, you have to jury rig things. I've had a lot of luck at Canyon Crest and some luck at San Diego Academy, but a lot of that has to do with finding somebody who's going to really kind of help shepherd the kid at school, get him engaged in a club or something that's like the robotics clubs at both of those schools have been wonderful and award-winning at times in recent years. Torrey Pines Science Olympiad has been really good for a lot of people too. So you sort of have to find the niche at the school.
And then you find somebody like me in an IEP meeting today about a kid that is not quite as verbal as everybody else, I wouldn't say is really high functioning, and really advocating that this kid should be diploma bound. And these people at San Diego are looking at me like I have 5 heads, I don't know what I'm talking about, and I said, you can do it. You'd have to assume these kids can do it. That's what it's all about. It's not about, okay, you are partially nonverbal, you don't speak very much, so you must be retarded, so we're going to put you in the SH program.
You know what's really funny? Anybody here from England? You know about the English system? At 16, you take a test, and that sort of decides whether you're going to actually get
Vocation.
professional training
Oh yeah,
or
what's
whether
that
you're
called?
going to. Pardon?
What is that called? It's,
I forget the name of it.
They
but
do it in Canada as well.
yeah, it's pretty amazing. They put a ceiling on you pretty early. I mean, everybody.
yeah.
It's pretty crazy. But yeah, we fight ceilings all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, how many of our kids would have been consigned to God knows what, who are now doing some pretty high-level stuff, and interesting and contributing to the world. Not that everybody can't contribute to the world in their own way, but we want people to sort of be who they can become.
We're having great luck at Canyon Crest with our daughter when she goes. But I mean, they bend over backwards and are very, very helpful. And I
Who's
love
they?
that.
Is it the resource department that's
Right,
the
there's
special
Coastal
day
Learning
people,
Academy.
or-
Pardon?
Coastal Learning Academy?
Right.
Yeah.
So
Coastal
at,
Learning Academy.
right.
Oh.
So it's like a section of the high school. So it's upstairs, and they've got some classrooms that are really small. I think her math class has like 7 or 8 kids or something, and it's really small. And her world history is small also, and she gets a lot of individualized help.
She's diploma bound.
Yes. Yeah.
And what they do, it's a school within a school where they, as they can, they farm you into the other classes, and it's it's the emo school. I mean, let's just say it. It's the place where you can be different and nobody really cares. So you've got lots of different kinds of kids and all kinds of crazy get-ups in the different classes. It's sort of an arts and engineering school. So they just there's no football team, I guess is sort of the way one would describe it. And so they're able to get people into the community pretty nicely. Although I'm having some luck at Torrey lately too, so I'm kind of impressed. Torrey, if you haven't been there, it's the quintessential Southern California high school. If you were going to make a movie, that would be the place you would make it. If you go at lunchtime, your eyes pop out of your head. Just you see the different groups of people.
And the cars that they drive.
And the cars.
The student parking lot just
But
driving.
that said, there are some kids who do well, some don't. But
I have one more thing about health insurance. I understand, the regional center social worker told me about something that's pending in the state legislature.
It's not pending.
It's not
It's
pending.
going,
so
it's
tell
not
me.
pending.
Well, it's pending at
been
the time,
passed.
she told me, I guess.
I'll tell you the part
passed,
that's
but-
pending. So I was actually part of the effort to write and get passed the
Well,
bill
thank you for that.
to force insurance companies to do what we had written into legislation in AB 88 in 1999. There's a law that said you have to pay for autism care if you're an insurance company. So what happened, the insurance companies mainly bailed because, as it turns out, it was only California-based insurance companies, and so insurance left the state of California. People had their insurance from Michigan. Delaware is a place where a lot of these companies are, and so it sort of didn't count. So now we got this law passed. If you're a citizen of the state, your insurance has to cover. Now at the same time, federal Affordable Care Act from Obama administration actually says the same thing, but because they're coming up with the rules and because it's sitting in the Supreme Court, the rules for the recent legislation are also sitting, because what happens is this legislation that we got passed is going to sundown in 2014 because the Affordable Care Act is going to come in and say what to do. So the rules that were being written for the Affordable Care Act need to be mirrored by the rules in California, otherwise it's going to be too confusing. So the committees up in Sacramento are kind of talking about procedure and process and waiting to see what the Supreme Court does. If the Supreme Court supports enough of the Affordable Care Act, then that process continues. California's process continues, and because California tends to lead the nation, whatever happens in California may well drive what happens in federal rules. So we have a lot of potential power in this process, depending on what the Supreme Court does. If the Supreme Court kills the Affordable Care Act based on whatever, then actually then 946, our legislation then goes forward, and we still get to create it, but we don't have to worry as much about the feds coming in and changing it all on us. So it's a bit of a mess right now.
So there's nothing as an effect now that we
No,
can
July
honestly...
1st,
July
insurance companies need to be offering ABA services if you have a child with autism.
Actually, behavioral health care, which includes
Behavioral health
ABA
care.
and others.
That's true.
So developmental is included under that, and floor time, some of those things
Yes.
provided by appropriate providers. But regional centers will say you need to use your insurance first, and they're the payer of last resort, right? And because the rules haven't been written, the insurance companies, although they'll be forced to pay, they're going to say, but we don't have rules. So they're going to fight it for a while. So expect fights. I've got a friend of mine, Jim Lantry. He's a lobbyist. We dragged him into this process. He now has a company that helps companies like Case, you probably don't need it, but CARES, other places, figure out how they're going to write contracts with insurance companies so that they'll start paying for the services for autism treatment. So we made a lot of progress, but there's always a fight. It's an adversarial process. The insurance companies really don't want to pay. They really don't want to pay. Neurologic disorder, they don't want to pay because it's
there
money.
forever. It's not going to go away.
It's lifelong.
Oh, I've always wondered why. Okay.
It's lifelong. But we are having a lot of success with some insurance companies already that have put it into effect. I do the military insurance, which is ECHO and TRICARE, UBH. Who's some of the others?
UBH, who's that?
United Behavioral Health, which
has
is
a really good
Optum.
autism.
Really?
Yeah.
Has a really good autism benefit.
For United Healthcare.
Now, what some of the insurance companies are doing, like Cigna is saying, well, it's a $15,000 deductible. So in other words, you have to meet $15,000
you're not
a
tapping
year
into the
of the benefit
ABA
before you're going to get the benefit.
Huh.
But regional center is saying that if you can prove that there's going to be a financial hardship to go the route of the insurance, then they will continue to provide the service. Or they're now talking about possibly reimbursing co-pays and some of the deductibles, what they're sort of talking
And
about.
because of that access problem, as well as the problem that not all regional centers provide all treatments, there's new legislation pending in the California State Senate that talks about eliminating some of those rules so that people aren't discriminated against because of their inability to pay or to move to another place to get the regional center